Welcome to Loaded and Rolling. I'm your host, Thomas Wasson. Now, trying the new format, this is a special episode as well. Most podcasts don't make it past 5. And a little shout out to not only the crew and staff. We have reached our 69th episode here at Loaded and Rolling. It is definitely one of those milepost things. People say you need to get to 100, but especially very thankful for everyone who believed in this podcast, as well as shout out to my sponsor, Skybits. And then if we have anyone else, I'd like to thank the Academy as well. So throwing that out there, a little bit of housework. There it is. Skybits, division of Amatex, sensors and everything. Really good stuff. I used them before. Made my blood pressure go a lot lower because we could tell the trailers were empty. Who would have thought? But a lot of research stuff going on today. I got to do a research corner, and I thought, well, why don't we bring one of our senior editorial researchers on to talk about some of the cool things that we do. I know as a trucking expert, I get to talk about some stuff, but I don't always get to see the cool things behind the scenes. So we're going to bring it in our next guest. Super excited to be welcoming on Joe Antoshak, senior editorial researcher here at FreightWaves. Prior to that, he was at Transport Topics as well, doing cool research stuff. We snatched him away. And Joe, I remember when we brought you on the research corner, we had you on a smaller screen. But as you can see right here, we got you on the big screen, sir. We're going big today. Yeah, Joe, you may be muted. Give me three eye blinks if you're being tortured. Let me have your line muted. Let's see if we can hear you. All right, we're gonna figure out what we're going on in the meantime. I'm gonna preface this with some slides here while we get Joe fixed up. Big things we're gonna be talking about today. First one is, of course, the disappointing outbound tender rejection index. It's gonna be paired up with outbound tender volumes. One of the conversations over the past at least week or so, it's Tuesday right now, has been we are seeing an increase in volumes on contracted freight, but surprisingly, rejection rates are still going down. So it's an interesting thing because you would assume that we were seeing a little bit of a rally over the past month or two, as you can see on our chart here, but it's kind of petered out even across the nation. I did a carrier update earlier today, and we are seeing some softness in the market. So that's going to be one thing that we're going to be talking about with Joe when we get him back in. Another one is going to be spot market rates. We're continuing to just be right about the bottom, you can tell as well. Over there in orange, we've got the fuel prices. So another big topic to watch as 2022 began into the current day as well is that we've seen this drastic spike in diesel fuel. And one of the cool things I learned was that some of it has to do with IMO 2020, which was a goal to get the fuel changed for ships. We're talking about maritime cargo ships, the very large ships. And so that was one thing that may be influencing the price, as well as OPEC cuts and Saudi Arabia adding a few extra cuts on as well. Let's pull back Joe in, see if we get a little bit of audio this time. I was previewing what we're digging into. Joe, can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, we are so back. We're a little bit of a spoiler. We're gonna go into talking about this disappointing outbound tender rejection in volume, but being on that research end as well. I wanted to grab some of your thoughts because it definitely feels like a weird situation going on. That we'd expect to see some continued upward movement moving into peak, but it looks like we're actually sliding backwards.
Yeah, unfortunately for carriers that have been sort of hanging on precariously, this peak season does seem to be playing out to be another muted one, which I know is not welcome news to those who watch these kinds of trends. But we've been tracking maritime imports and stuff a little bit more upstream, and we've seen a bit of a bump, but not dramatically so, not to the level that you would need to sort of meet the level of trucking capacity that's still in the market. So unfortunately, it looks like peak season is going to be not so great, and for those carriers that are still living on the margins, as well they all are, but the ones that are living a little bit more precariously. It could be the end for them.
And we've seen with the research part as well, with surveys that you conduct, that carriers have not been feeling as well. We've seen some changes in brokers. For folks who haven't really caught up on our surveys, I know we have one coming up. What's been the kind of vibe so far in some of the ones we've taken? And tell us, how often do we take them as well?
Yeah, so I think what you're referencing and what we talked about earlier was these freight sentiment indexes that we started tracking quarterly in we started Q4 of last year, right? So it's sort of a new thing, but we've been tracking it every quarter this year, and yeah, we've seen some interesting trends. So first of all, carriers were actually overall negative in Q2, right? Which not a big surprise for anyone in the market. I mean, it was a terrible time. Our NTI.USA, our spot market index, hit its bottom in May, I believe. Conditions were really, really bad. And so these freight sentiment indexes track, different things like near term, longer term profitability, and then, workforce stuff and big business investment. And basically, if you have a negative overall score, it means that you're doing really poorly right now. You don't feel positive about the market, and it's sort of a big deal for an overall score to be negative. Anyway, so that was Q2. What was interesting about Q3 is that carriers started ticking up. And the reason for that is not necessarily because of the near term stuff, conditions are still bad, but because we were progressing through this down cycle and they could project out 12 months and say, okay, things are going to be a little bit better when I look out to Q3 2024, right? Which is in line with what a lot of analysts think. But what else was interesting was that shippers actually trended down over the quarter, and for Q3 recorded the lowest overall score. So I should have brought some of those charts on. I'm sorry I don't have them, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens here in Q4. We're going to start surveying next week, it looks like, and we'll update those numbers. I don't know, maybe early November, probably something like that.
I can only imagine as well, there's probably a situation where if you're a shipper, you're worried about service levels, but we're also hearing about record number of carriers leaving the market. So sometimes I wonder, when you're looking through the survey, trying to parse through and figure out the vibes, that maybe it's a situation where there is some concern because if enough capacity leaves the market, it's almost like you still have this 2-year trauma from when rejection rates were 20+%. No one could get anything covered.
Yeah, and I think that has kind of played out this year with how sticky contract rates have been, right? I mean, our rates.usa, which is what we use to track the spread between contract and spot rates, it's remained really wide, and van contract rates have stayed. I mean, they've declined over the year for sure, but there hasn't been like a massive drop off like. I know some people were expecting to happen. It's just been sort of like a steady descent, and I think a lot of that has to do with that trauma on shippers' part, where it's like we're not trying to chase anyone out of the market. We want good quality carriers, and these relationships matter to us to some extent, as opposed to like trying to race to the absolute bottom to make as much as they possibly can, or lose the least they possibly can on transportation.
That's one thing that strikes me. I'm working with some shippers as well, and being on the trucking side, you always have those customers who just want to push down. They're very they care more about price than service, so they're going to push really hard. Then you have others that are going to do the inverse, of course. But it does feel as though a gradual tightening to try to find that breaking spot versus just wholeheartedly, chop that transportation budget. And one of the things I'm curious about is if we're going to continue to see this gradual situation, or if it reaches by Q1 of 2024 some kind of bottoming out, because it does have that weird feeling where we're about 75-ish cents per mile last time I checked on that spot line haul to contract spread. And I do wonder how much that'll change, if it'll actually improve any, or if this is like a new normal because of higher costs.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's like, we feel we have a pretty good sense of it, right? And theoretically, we say like a balanced market is what, somewhere between 30 and 50 cents, right? But it's not like we have decades and decades of data, so it's possible that it could have changed. Now, it's tough to say if like Q1 2024 is going to be the time when we start to see a material difference, like a bounce back. But I do think, and part of my general theory for like Research Corner this morning and coming on here is that I think we are kind of approaching like the last gasp of this down cycle. And the reason why I say that is because rejections have, gone back to ticking down again. Rates continue to be very low. And then diesel has climbed and it's eased a little bit this week, according to the EIA. So hopefully that'll continue. But basically, you just have like another situation where, there's not a whole lot of reprieve for carriers who are already really struggling, right? And then you compile the rising expense layer of high diesel prices as a result of the global shortages, and you've got a pretty dangerous situation, I would say.
That's what threw me off as well. Saudi OPEC cuts, in addition, Morgan Stanley talking about if we're going to see like over $100 a barrel for crude. Of course, that impacts it with the distillation and stuff. That's one of the things that I'm kind of curious about, because it felt like prior to any movement by OPEC, the price of diesel was slowly going back down to some new high. But now we have a wrench thrown in it, which could potentially snuff out more carriers.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why I say it is important to note that the benchmark diesel price declined this week, as announced last night, and that was the first time in a number of weeks for that to happen. So that is very good news, right? It suggests that maybe things are stabilizing. Refineries are pumping out more fuel, but it's one of those things where we're cautiously optimistic, on behalf of the carriers who are stretched thin. Of course, there's the other side of things where it's like, capacity needs to leave the market right now in the absence of a ton of volume materializing somewhere. And that, evidently with what looks to be probably a muted peak season coming up, that's not happening. So, eventually things will normalize, and it's looking like that's going to be more capacity leaving, and we'll probably see a bit of a spike toward the end of the year where the net trucking authorities ticks down to a greater degree.
Yeah, right now it feels like a slow burn. I want to switch gears a little bit. Very, very curious your experiences in transportation as well. You came from a place called Transport Topics, so you'd think they'd, tell us about how did you get into this industry? You're very data driven as well as our surveys and research. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, well, there's no crazy story. I think, like a lot of people in transportation that I've met, I kind of just fell into it. I needed a job, and I happened to get this one to Transport Topics. At the time, I knew nothing about trucking. And of course, if you don't know Transport Topics, it's a very long-running, legacy trade publication for trucking. It's run under ATA, and it's like a semi-independent body within ATA, right? But anyway, yeah. So I kind of fell into it, and I just right off the bat, working under a guy named Dan Berth, put out the at the time top 50 logistics companies list, top 100 for hire, top 100 private, and then top 50 global freight carriers lists, and it really just threw me headfirst into the big industry players, and so I kind of had to learn on the job about how the industry works, like what different types of logistics services exist, different types of trucking modes, all these different things. And then I came over to FreightWaves and got even more involved in sort of the real-time day-to-day data, and now it feels like I just live in numbers, and it's great.
It's a fun experience because we also have our top for hire carriers, and we're doing a similar listing for it because it helps with the editorial. But you're in DC as well, and I think that like when we're talking about trucking and stuff. It does feel like there's two different types. You have legacy media out in New York and large metros, but you also have this specialized one, like ATA does a lot of lobbying. What's the vibe like in DC? Did you get to ever go to any of this cool Capitol Hill stuff, or was it mostly like chilling out in the office? Because I can only imagine being so close to the decision makers, you may get access or get to check out some stuff.
Yeah, so I actually did not do a whole lot of that. I mean, the closest I got to action outside of the office was like a handful of business trips and conference stuff, that sort of thing. When I was working there, our office was in Virginia, actually, in Arlington. So not so close to DOT. But since I've left, they've opened up their new office, which from a balcony, like overlooks the DOT. So they're much more in the action now. But yeah, the reason why I said like semi-independent, it is mostly separate from like the day-to-day lobbying stuff. There are certainly, there's a trickle down effect, no doubt, from the ATA. But in terms of actual lobbying, it's like, unless you are the government beat reporter, shout out to Eugene Malero, who I think you know of, Thomas.
Yeah.
You're not down on Capitol Hill every day.
I remember because when we do Sirius, Eugene is usually on Mark Willis's show prior to that. So we have Todd Maiden as our beat reporter as well. I think that's crazy. You can just go across the street now. That's a smart play if I was wanting to do some lobbying, just wave across the street. Looking at like other legacy publications, Landline I think is under OIDA, and then we have some other ones smattered around like Overdrive as well. Is that something where have you seen any of the other ones or rubbed shoulders with the other groups while you're in DC, or is it kind of nobody talks to the other team, I guess, when you're thinking about cats and dogs or ATA and OIDA?
Yeah, well, it's not totally separate. But I mean, I think that, well, the main connection is that, you have some employees like, change jobs right in between them. Like, I think my introduction to the JOC, for instance, was just through someone who, I knew had worked at Transport Topics, or like heard stories of him working at Transport Topics, and then went over to JOC. I didn't know this person, but they were well respected, and so that was like, oh, okay, this is a different publication. But I mean, I think that we're in a pretty interesting place in the media sphere. As I mean, it's not necessarily new to right now; it's been happening for a long time. But I do think that the sort of trade media in freight is changing pretty significantly right now. Like you've got a lot more focus and interest and sort of like vigor in like the social media space, and that is a space where outside of LinkedIn, a lot of these legacy publications don't really play in so much. Like they're not meme lords like maybe they need to be to get this kind of next generation of freight people. But I don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because most of them, like you mentioned, are already under umbrellas. So there's some buffer from, like clear market exposure.
Yeah, and it sometimes can feel like an Alabama family reunion too, because everyone goes to different, organizations. It's like, oh, you're all in the family. One thing I'm curious about, we have a research arm. You're part of the research team. We do work for customers, so this is kind of like you said, the evolving nature of media. I'm on the editorial expert talking head. Shout out to all the other communities people. But when we're looking at that, what are some of the things, because customers come to us to try to solve problems, and you being able to see the research, I think it'd be helpful for listeners to see what are some of the types of, we can't name names, but what are some of like, are there shippers, carriers, brokers? Who's the kind of people who want this kind of data, and what questions do they typically want answers for? Is it like outside, in, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the biggest parts of my job is to help develop these surveys in partnership with a sponsored company. And basically, we survey a specific part of our readership, shippers, carriers, brokers, or some combination of those, on a topic that matters to the sponsor company. And when I say matters, it sort of changes company to company. What I'm always recommending to people is to think about it as like as journalistically as possible, like find something that's relevant in the market right now, and then try to find a way to cater that to your own strategic needs. Anyway, uh, we field these surveys, we get the data together, and then that data goes into a custom white paper that can then be downloaded free of charge to whoever's interested in it. So, right, I mean, we can't name names for projects that are ongoing, but one of the recent ones that has done really well so far, I believe, I think in large part because it is so topical, is a partnership with Triumph Pay for a double brokering survey and white paper. And that is one of the rare ones that I developed the survey and then also had the chance to write it. And it's the first white paper I've written. And it was a lot of fun. But anyway, you can check it out. You can go download it. I mean, it looks at, sort of what percentage of broker contacts say that double brokering is a big deal. How much is it affecting them? And then we get into some strategies about how brokers can stay more alert and avoid falling victim to fraudulent double brokering in the future. But there's good stuff, and we really do produce these white papers pretty often. So I think on our site, it's like if you're on a desktop, you go to like read at the top, and then you go to white papers, and there's a whole list of them that it's updated whenever we put one out. So just tons of really good resources there. And yeah, if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, oh, we could be interested in some market research, definitely just get in touch with me, get in touch with Thomas, and we'll set you up.
That's what blows my mind, because equity shops, private equity, will also do paid research, but they charge like bukudos and stuff. That's part of their income stream, and you get analysts and you pay for it per hours worked and charged. But this hybrid media model, I think, is so fascinating, because you did come from a large legacy player that I remember Transport Topics when I was at US Express, and you'd see the quarterly ones and you would just have them on a desk somewhere. And like, that was the distribution method. The data was like, so, it could be either very timely still, or you're still looking behind. Being at two different media companies, and now you're at this one. Is there any of them, like, other than obviously FreightWaves, has anyone really recognized the value of this kind of hybridization? Or is it still something where I know, like, landline, you have ATA, you have OIDA, you have various, ATRI probably has an arm. Is that something where you almost have to wait and see if the main mothership is providing the info? Or is it kind of like the journalists are like, well, this is how we've always done it. We got our conference. I'm not in a hurry to upgrade this, or looking down on this new tech?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that it's hard to generalize this stuff, in totality. But I do think that for the most part, my impression of freight transportation media, particularly the established brands that have that existed in the 20th century, let's say, and developed their names then. They have, from what I can tell, on the whole, been slow to adopt new technologies or new ways of doing things. And I mean, it makes sense if you're a legacy brand. What you've been doing has worked. Why change it, right? And there's other sort of like institutional barriers to moving quickly when you're in those environments. But I think more and more, and this sort of goes to the change I was talking about earlier with, social media really becoming, Freight X, right? Like this is a whole thing where a lot of particularly younger people in the industry are kind of changing things a little bit. I think that these legacy publications are going to be under more and more pressure to kind of modernize their approach a little bit. I don't think anyone has the capacity to match like FreightWaves TV, but I would expect that they would start playing a little bit more in the social media space and maybe investing a little bit more in like social media managers, for instance, that kind of thing. But we'll see. I mean, I, for the most part, think it's like a live or die kind of thing. But at the same time, it's like these organizations, some of them aren't functioning as like independent bodies. They're sort of like news arms of larger entities that are not dependent on the media landscape. So who knows how it's going to shape up.
I feel like that's kind of one of the conversations. I feel like we do a whole conversation on that because it's so fascinating. I came from operations. This is my first stint in media over 2 years now. And that's what blew my mind the most was you set up a shop, but you also, once you set up your shop, you're also doing your lobbying and your outreach, but you're also having a friendly publication to do it and send it. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that. Joe, got like less than a minute left. Anything on the horizon we should be watching out for? And then also best way to reach out if folks want to contribute or help out.
Yeah, definitely keep an eye out if you're on our newsletter lists for those Q4 Freight Sentiment Index surveys. They're going to be coming out starting next week, and that's carrier, broker, and shippers. We send different surveys, but we're asking basically the same questions. So keep an eye out for that, and yeah, go and check out our white papers. There's lots of good resources there. If you're in the market for one, feel free to shoot me an email. It's the letter J as in Joe, and then Antoshak, Antoshak, at FreightWaves.com, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter or X or whatever they call it now.
Everywhere.
Yeah, I will. Anywhere.
I love it. Joe, thanks for coming on again, sir. We're going to reconnect again. See you at the next Research Corner. Got to wrap up the show. Running out of time. Hear the Oscar music playing. We're ending our 69th episode, but don't worry. We'll be back next week, Tuesday, 1 p.m. for number 70. We're going to do it live, folks. See you then.